This class is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be a continuation of some themes from the last class. So we were talking last time about the emotional discharge process, how powerful these inborn healing mechanisms are for us. And what we're going to add today is just a couple of terms that we want to use and that really also help sharpen some concepts for us. In general, in the Peak Living Network, we try to avoid developing a lot of specialized terminology. I don't really like the way organizations and healing approaches start to have all their special words you're supposed to use for everything. So we try to avoid that as much as we can. But there are times when a term sharpens a concept enough that it is really worth having that terminology. So just a couple terms we're going to learn today. So I was explaining last time how deep discharge happens really when things are getting better in our lives. Not necessarily in the big picture, but certainly within the context of that day or that week, that moment, things are kind of looking up. And that's the way the releases are designed. There are reasons why they are designed to work as things are on the way up. So we have a term that we use in co-counseling that we call balance of attention, or sometimes you'll hear people call it balance of awareness. And what we mean by this balance of attention is that the times when we're going to be able to release feelings deeply are times when our awareness is roughly balanced between the distress, the pain, what it is that's hurting us, and our awareness of aspects of our reality that are very different, that are counter to that pain, that are in some sense the opposite of it. And that's when our feelings are going to tend to really flow out of us to be able to really discharge them. So an example is, let's say somebody's crying and you hold them. Typically, they're going to start to cry harder, especially if you don't pat or rub them, because that actually tends to stop people from crying. Patting or rubbing sends these don't cry messages, please stop messages, whether you say them in words or not. So if someone's crying, you want to just hold them and hold your hands still. So if you're being held while you're crying, this is going to tend to create just in itself a balance of attention, because you got the sadness, whatever it is that you're crying about, but then you've got the opposite of that, which is that someone's holding you. You have a loving person holding you. That's the opposite of your distress. And so that's the concept of balance of attention. When we're in one of those moments where we're just laughing our butts off or just crying our eyes out, we may stop even noticing that we're being held, or whatever it is, that's creating that balance. But on some level, we're still aware of it. So I don't mean that it's important to try to remain aware of both things. That's not important. If the discharge is happening deeply, then on some level, unconsciously, we are remaining aware of the other side, the balancing side. But it's not that we need to try to think about it. That's not important. If things are flowing out of us, that's what we're looking for. And then that means that balance is somehow present. Sometimes you can't even tell exactly what made it possible to go so deep. But it can be as simple as something that happened 3 days ago that we're not even thinking about anymore, that just caused this kind of strength to build up inside of us, or this kind of hopefulness to build up inside of us. It can be that someone's paying really good attention to us. Loving attention from another human being is often all it takes to create that balance of attention. So then, with balance of attention comes a related term, which is what we call a counter to distress, or you'll sometimes hear people from more traditional co-counseling call it a contradiction to distress. We decided to call it a counter to distress because a contradiction to distress sounds too much like telling someone, no, you don't feel that way, or that didn't happen to you. And either term is fine, but in the Peak Living Network, we call it a counter to distress. So that's this side of the equation. Right here, you got the sadness. Here, you got the person holding you. The person, by holding you, by giving you a positive, loving attention, is countering your distress. And that's what's allowing you to have a deep cry. When people have big gang laughs, right, it's the fact of the presence of all these other people that you care about and enjoy, and the fact that you're all laughing together. It's that sense of being accompanied is countering whatever the fear or anxiety is that's being discharged through all that laughter. You'll remember that the primary role of laughter is for discharging fear, particularly in the form of anxiety. And so in many ways, how we think of what a counselor's role is in co-counseling is you're looking for ways to counter the client's distress, because that's what's going to allow them to actually get the feelings to flow out of them. So a counter to distress means something that somehow is the opposite of what they're feeling. Often that's just going to be your loving attention, because our wounds are so rooted in simply not having anyone giving us attention at key times when hurtful things were happening to us especially, or sometimes just because we just weren't getting enough attention, period, and that created a hurt in itself. But so many of our wounds are about bad things were happening and no one was paying attention to us. So just your caring, loving attention is very often going to be all the counter to distress that the person needs to be able to feel what they need to feel and get it to flow out of them. But many times that's not going to do it, and we're going to be looking for other ways that we can balance off their distress. So if they're feeling very lonely, if that's the feelings that they're working on, we may, and that's going to be like old feelings of loneliness, right, from the past. We're going to focus on saying things like, hey, I'm right here with you. Notice me. Hey, take a quick look at me. We never put the client under pressure to look at us for a long time. That's actually going to distract them from their feelings. But for them to take a quick look, hi, I'm here. That's one of the ways we can counter distress. We counter distress through all kinds of techniques that we use, and a lot of what you'll be learning in the subsequent lessons about co-counseling will be all these different techniques that help to create that balance of attention for someone that counters their distress. So those are just some things that I want to add to wrap up from the previous class. And what we're going to focus on next, and what the main focus of this lesson is about the asking of questions. And so much of what a counselor does that makes your client feel cared about, makes you feel like you're there, makes them feel like you're there, and it helps them feel their feelings, is the questions that you ask. So I'm going to address first some things that I find that new counselors in particular, new co-counselors in particular, tend to be concerned about or wondering about. So how many questions should I ask? Well, I can't give you a formula about that, but what I'm going to tend to say is like medium. Go for medium. Ask questions pretty often during the person's turn, but don't be peppering them with questions. We don't want it to feel like it's an interview, and we don't want our questions to be distracting the person from a track that they're on. Our questions should be helping them continue on the track that they're on. So a moderate number of questions. Next thing that people will ask me is, well, what if I'm really asking the question just because I'm curious? Well, I would say, for the most part, go ahead and ask the question. Unless your question is just somehow like outright nosy, go ahead and ask the question. That's not really a problem that you're asking the question out of curiosity. Curiosity is a sign of caring. It's a sign of wanting to know about the person. It's a sign of wanting to know what his or her experience has been. So it's not likely to bother your partner that you're asking questions out of curiosity. And I'm going to give you some suggestions about how to use questions that aim the person towards their feelings. But that doesn't mean that all our questions have to be designed to aim the person towards their feelings. Our questions are mostly to show that we care, which will help them get to their feelings, the fact that we're caring and wanting to know what happened to them. Which is the next thing that I find new counselors really sometimes worry about is, well, am I asking the right kind of questions? And in a few minutes, I'll tell you a few kinds of questions not to ask, but most questions are the right kinds of questions. The general principle in co-counseling is that we're not asking questions that are aimed at analysis. We're asking questions that are aimed at feelings. And so we're generally not going to ask things like, oh, well, do you think this is connected to other things? Like a lot of times in other kinds of counseling, including professional therapy, there's a lot of focus on making connections between things. That's not a big focus in co-counseling, because we're about feelings, and making connections doesn't necessarily lead the person to be able to feel any more than they felt before. So we're not after analysis. We're not after questions that ask, well, what do you think you're really feeling, or what do you think this is really about? That would be the client's right to decide that they think this is really about something else. But our job as counselors is to assume that it's about exactly what they're saying it's about. We're not in the business of deciding that somehow we know that, or we suspect that this is really about something else. That's not our place, and it doesn't work well. It's the notion that somehow we have to get to what these feelings are really about is in many ways misleading, and I'll explain why, because that's actually connected to the next thing I'm going to talk about. So the next thing that people wonder about is asking the question, what does this remind you of? Because I'm often going to ask someone, what does this remind you of? It's a common question we ask in co-counseling. And so then people wonder, well, wait a minute, Linda, you were just saying we're not looking for connections. Why are you asking, what does this remind? Why are you asking the client, what does this remind you of? I'm asking that of them to feel around, to sort of search around for places where the feelings will move. If the feelings they're talking about today are moving through them, I'm not going to ask them, what does this remind you of? I actually believe that would be a mistake. We should be focused on what the person says they're feeling if those feelings are moving well. In other words, if they're in touch with those feelings, if their energy is remaining positive, and especially if they're managing to discharge those feelings, I don't want to point them towards something else. So when I ask someone, what does this remind you of? I'm not in any way suggesting, well, maybe this is really about something else. What I'm suggesting is, let's try some other spots that are connected to this that might help the feelings move through you, where you might be able to discharge them, and then that's probably going to help relieve whatever the recent thing is that's up as well. Now, there's a belief among many people in many approaches to emotional healing that working earlier in life is deeper work. I disagree. I don't see any evidence for that. When I encourage people to work on issues from earlier in life, to work early, it's not because I believe that's deeper work. It's because I find that the feelings from earlier in life are often easier to get moving. That to have like really good progress on feelings, to have them move through us, to be able to discharge them, tends to be a lot easier about something that's 10 years or 20 years or 30 years ago than about something that happened this morning. That varies. It varies. Actually, sometimes things that happen this morning are very available to be discharged. Let's say things that happened last month were things that are chronically weighing us down at this point in our lives, which tend to be the hardest things to discharge, are the things that are just on us day after day after day, just like these kind of chronic weights that we carry around. We can get at those feelings, but they're harder. And so I'm going to push people towards earlier stuff just because it tends to work. That's where we're more likely, because we have more space, precisely because we have more space from it, we're more likely to be able to get experiences from back there really moving. The depth of discharge, the depth of healing that's happening can only be measured in the depth of the discharge. If I'm laughing my butt off or crying my guts out about something that happened 20 minutes ago, that's absolutely as deep work as processing something that happened 50 years ago. If I'm processing it at the same depth, it doesn't matter. Another way to think about this is that all of our experiences, all of our wounding experiences, are like a matrix inside of us, in the sense that they're all connected to all kinds of other experiences that were in any way similar. That's just how our minds work. Our minds form these webs. And so anytime you're healing anything, you're also healing a bunch of other things from earlier in life and later in life that were connected to that. Figuring out what the connections are is actually not very important. It's because it just happens automatically. Anytime you're healing something, you are also carrying away a lot of stuff from earlier in life and later in life. That's just how these emotional release processes work. That's how emotional healing works, and it takes care of itself. It's not something you need to make happen. So the next thing I'll talk about is a few kinds of questions to avoid asking. So first of all, we want to avoid questions that tend to inspire defensiveness. So like, don't ask the person, well, why did you not do something about that? Or why didn't you speak up? If the person says, I couldn't speak up, you might say, well, tell me about that. Why were you unable to? That's different, because that's a supportive question. That's saying like, what was going on for you? But a question like why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that is going to cause defensiveness. Avoid questions that appear to make excuses for people who wounded your client. So if your client is talking about what somebody once did to him or her, don't ask questions like, well, don't you think that person meant well? Or don't you think that person was just trying to do X, Y, or Z? That's going to sound like you're covering that person or making it sound like what they did was somehow less. And then avoid questions, as I said, that analyze. Do you think that you're really upset about something else? So last, I'm just going to take you through a bunch of examples of kinds of good questions to ask, and then in the co-counseling manual, there's a whole list, and it's one of the separate handouts that are in the manual that'll just give you so many ideas. And then also in the Joyous Recovery, there's a whole chapter on asking questions. The chapter that's called A Surprise Beginning is just full of examples of kinds of questions to ask people. We all want to be working on getting better on all fronts in our lives, not just in co-counseling, on all fronts in our lives. We want to get better at asking people more questions and at listening well to their answers to those questions. So here's kinds of things that are just always great to be asking. How are you feeling? What's that feeling like? Tell me more about that. What is that like for you? What was that like for you when they're talking about something from the past? Can you tell me more about that? That's a question we don't tend to think to ask, and it's just such a simple question, and it almost always leads to the person being able to say more. So anytime your mind is just blank about what to ask, there's one that's always available. Can you say more about that? Can you tell me more about that? Would you like to take a minute to just feel that? That's not so much a question as some counseling guidance, but it takes the form of a question. So when you see someone, you see an emotion kind of moving through their face, and then they seem to go right on to the next thing. Very common that we do that. We tend to skip past emotional spots, to dance away from them a little bit. Do you want to take a moment to just be with that? You want to just be quiet for a moment? You want to just feel that feeling for a moment? Great question to ask. Questions that try to guess what a feeling was like. So, gee, did that, what you were just telling me about, did that feel like they were all ganging up on you? Or did that make you feel alone? Or did that make you feel like it was all up to you to figure out a solution to what was going on? I'm just giving you random examples. There's questions that try to get at, try to get at what this was like, but in the counselor's words, right? The counselor's saying, was that kind of like this? A lot of times you're going to get it right, and that's going to feel good to the client. The client's going to say, yeah, that is what it felt like. But the thing is, even if you get it wrong, the fact that you tried to take a guess at what that feeling was like is still usually going to be helpful, because then your client is going to say to you, well, no, it wasn't that I felt like they were ganging up on me. It was that I came out feeling like I wasn't smart, like I couldn't say the right thing. So your question, even though you got it wrong, still helped the client to get at what the feeling is. In other words, it helped sharpen their description of the feeling. So trying to imagine what this must have been like for them and reflect it to the client is always going to be a useful try. And then if you didn't get it right, then they'll clarify it, and that'll be really helpful also. Does this feeling reside in your body somewhere? I don't use that question a lot, but I think it's a good question to ask. The reason I'm cautious about it is because that's a question that can easily take people away from their feelings rather than towards their feelings. So if you notice that the question is actually getting them into their head rather than into their body or into their feelings, drop it. And if they say no, I don't really connect it to any particular part of my body, don't push on that. It's like, let it go. That question can really work or totally not work. A question you can ask early in sessions: what do you need to focus on today? What's on top? What's been leaning on you hardest lately? What do you need right now? This is a question we forget to ask. I forget to ask it enough when I'm in the counseling role. Clients often, we're trying to guess what the person might need, but they sometimes know what they need. What do you feel like you need to spend your time on right now? Or what do you feel like would be really helpful to hear me say right now? What could I do that's most helpful right now? If you're counseling in person, do you need me to sit closer to you? Do you need me to sit farther away from you? Do you need me to have a hand on you? Do you need me to not have a hand on you? A lot of times they're going to know what they need. And it's a question that we really could stand to be in the habit of asking way more often. When they're talking about things that were very injurious in the past, what should have happened instead? That's a great question. It gives them an opportunity to kind of vent out. Well, they should have done this. They should have done this other thing. This is how it should have been. This is how my whole society should have been set up. I shouldn't have lived in such an oppressive society. Like, just be able to lay out what a right life would look like. And that also, by the way, can be very helpful coming from the counselor. Sometimes the counselor can just say, geez, that they shouldn't have done what they did. They should have done this. And that sort of voice speaking for what's right, for how things ought to be done, that can feel really good to the client. It can feel like you're really sticking up for them. What do you wish you could have said or done? Because in so many of our wounding experiences, we were paralyzed by circumstances, by our powerlessness, by danger, or sometimes we just couldn't get our minds to work right because we were so panicked or so hurt. What do you wish you could have said or done? Always a great question to ask. How did you get by? How did you survive? That's particularly good when you're asking about a whole period of years. Like, how did you get through your childhood, or how did you get through that year when you were living in that awful place, or whatever it is? Like, we draw upon things, whether as children or as teens or as adults. Like, we draw upon things, and we find our ways to get through. And that's something really to be proud of. It's also a whole realm that can easily lead to that kind of balance of attention that I was talking about. Because when we remember how we survived, and when we remember what we drew strength from, that often will kind of create that balance of attention that then will allow us to start to discharge deeply how terrible the things that we were having to survive at that time. What did you do well during that period in life? Or this question can be used in a lot of different sort of lengths of time, covering a lot of different lengths of time, and can be recent or long ago. What did you do well in that situation? How did you show courage? How did you show intelligence? How did you show willpower? How did you show capacity for survival? How did you show an ability to keep loving people in circumstances where it was very hard to keep loving people? How did you do it? How are you here today? It's a miracle that you're here today. How are you still on your feet? Wonderful kind of questions. And then last one that I'm going to suggest for today, and like I say, lots more and lists in your manual or in the Joyous Recovery. What are you proud of? What are you proud of about yourself? Tell me what you feel good about who you've been and what you've done. So keep asking questions. I think the art of asking questions is so central to the whole art of being an effective counselor in the co-counseling context. And so it's a skill that we want to just spend a lifetime developing, how we get questions that show more caring, questions that more effectively point people towards their feelings and help them discharge those feelings, questions that that help a person say what they need to say. And so this is one of the core arts of being an effective counselor.